Hello and welcome to Founded, where we find the stories you missed in history class because the tea was hot before they dumped it into the harbor. I'm Tori Phantom, and joining me today is someone whose favorite color might be purple, Gwenna Lathland.
Yep. Hi.
Is it purple?
Purple it is. It's not purple.
Well, I failed that pop quiz. Are you ready for yours?
Do I get a pop quiz then?
You do. You get a pop quiz. Are you ready?
Yes.
Okay. What founding father grew up in the same town as John Hancock?
John Adams.
Hooray! Correct. What were the writs of assistance?
That was the thing that allowed them to start seizing the boats because they wanted to. Or no, they could ask for the cops' help to do it.
Yes, that was basically they could search and seizure without reason, really. They could just be like, I feel like you might be smuggling. I'm going to come and take your stuff now.
Right.
And who gave a speech against the writs of assistance in 1761? This person also had mega beef with Massachusetts Lieutenant Governor Thomas Hutchinson.
Oh, that was a whole chunk of them, but that would be Samuel Adams.
Samuel Adams' friend. It was his friend.
Oh, Otis. Lightning Boy.
Yes. Lightning Boy. James Otis Jr., who died of
Apparently
lightning
the way
strike.
to get me to remember obscure founding fathers is to give me their hamster deaths.
Yeah. So good news. That happens a lot. Don't worry. You'll be remembering a lot of them. All right. Last question. Why could only land-owning white men vote?
Classism.
Kind of. That was your trick question of the day. We're going to get to that this episode.
Okay.
Because we've been talking...
Normally, when the question is, why can only rich white men do anything? The answer is normally classism.
Well, in a way, yes. However, we're going to explore the nuance of what that actually meant contextually at the time.
Okay.
Because it's deeper than that, right? Just like no taxation without representation. It was deeper than taxes.
Right.
So... yeah, because like we've been talking a whole lot about Samuel Adams, but as it turns out, he wasn't the only notable Adams of the time. Today,
correct,
we are going to dive into Abigail Adams' husband, the man who much rather would have been a farmer, John Adams. Because John Adams can give us...
Sit down, John.
Yeah, John Adams can give us much more context into the way the world worked all the way back then. And that's why he's entering the story today, because he's not actually relevant to the bigger picture until we get quite a bit past the Sugar Act. He played a smaller role starting around 1765. But his upbringing is, I mean, it was the same time as John Hancock. So let's talk about...
just down the street from him until... John got adopted by his Uncle Thomas. See, I was paying attention.
You were paying attention. And then they met back up at Harvard. So
correct.
So we are going to be talking about Abigail Adams' husband, John Adams. And if you are not chronologically listening to this show, that is fine. But if you are listening chronologically, this is specifically relevant because we ended last episode talking about how Samuel Adams was going to all the social clubs that he didn't belong to, whether he was in that class or not. And the colonial class hierarchy influences every bit of how all of these stories unfold. And before we get into John Adams, I want to bring you to a moment in this book I was reading about John Adams. It is called John Adams, A Life. I'll put a picture of it up on the screen here. And if you're watching.
And on today's episode of Bibliophage, available everywhere you find your favorite podcasts.
And I've told you every time that I read a biography about a Bostonian that it's also kind of about Samuel Adams.
Yes.
So in this John Adams A Life book, here's a quote about Samuel Adams. Despite a Despite a comfortable childhood and a degree from Harvard College, Samuel Adams' most noteworthy aspect in 43 years was his singular lack of achievement. And I think that's hilarious.
This dude has all the reason to have done everything. And what's he got to his name? Nothing.
Nothing. He like bankrupted several of his businesses, squandered his inheritance, and threatened the cops for trying to take his dad's estate. So, but then he went on to like lead a revolution. So now we're going to talk about Abigail Adams' husband.
Yes.
So John Adams' dad, bet you can't guess his name.
Would that be John?
Yeah, it was John Adams. So John
Yeah,
Adams'
it was John Adams. Yeah.
John Adams' dad, John Adams, was a farmer.
Wait, no, we need to take an aside here. Okay, we need to roll back. You can't just pass. So you had to define several John Hancocks. There were multiple Samuel Adamses. Now we're on another Adams family, and there's multiple Johns. What was it with like the whole 16th, 17th, and 18th century that were like, we only know 4 names? Why?
Well, and back then, they also named their daughters after the mothers.
Correct. Right. Yeah. They only knew 4 names.
I just feel like
why
it would
was
be
everyone named Mary Elizabeth? And then they would just randomly call that one Katie.
Yes. They would just give them a different name. That's what they would call them.
I don't understand the naming conventions. And it's really annoying when you're only verbally listening to history and it's John. And then do they have the like decency to have different last names? No, they're all named Adams. Okay. Crash out done. Tell me about Abigail Adams' husband, whose dad was also named John.
So John Adams' dad, John Adams, was a farmer, a cord waiter, which was someone who made new shoes using leather, had to look that up, and a deacon at the church where...
Oh, more deacons, got it.
Yeah, where second John Hancock, not signature boy, was the preacher.
Okay.
So John Adams, one, was not formally educated, and he was never formally a part of the elite in Braintree, but he was well respected and seen as intelligent, and he ended up serving the town as a tax collector, militia officer, selectman, tithingman, and of course deacon at one time or another. Now, this was during a time where you could legally kick strangers out of your town for not being legal residents. So while John Adams' dad, John Adams, was well liked and respected, he was still a middling sort. So middling sort is it's the middle class, right? And movement at this time, it could happen from one social class to the next, but a person would have to possess and demonstrate the qualifications necessary for their new position, because it was in bad taste to pretend to be something you're not. And the social hierarchy at this time was seen as a natural order. So no one should rock the boat, even if they wanted to. It wasn't just dependent on property and money.
Well, and it was more than just, well, you were born to this. No. Like at the time, these folks really believed and internalized, not only for those of a religious bent, which there were many, but not all, as the history books would lead us to believe, but there were a whole bunch who religion says, no, God chose those people to be the rich people, and God chose those people to be the blacksmiths and the working class and the middling class. And no, God needs me to be a scullery maid. It would be vain and egotistical of me to aspire to more than being a scullery maid.
Exactly. And it was at this time, people were thought to have been bred for the occupation. For the class they were born into. It was just that was the natural order and where they were meant to be.
But that being said, what that also lent to is if you firmly believed, and I'm not saying that this is like well and healthy thinking, but if you firmly believed the best I could ever be is a blacksmith, you know who doesn't crap on blacksmiths? people who think that is their God ordained calling in life to be the best blacksmith ever to smith the black.
Yeah. Yes.
Like, and so like there was a pride in, yes, the upper classes would look down their nose upon the lower classes, banging the hammers and sweeping the dust. But they also had a higher level of respect for, well, if they don't sweep the dust, who's gonna? Because I can't.
Yeah. And at this time, the colonies lacked a nobility, a gentry, an aristocracy like you would see in French, in English.
What's an aristocracy, or not an aristocracy? I know what an aristocracy is. What's a gentry?
Very similar. Very similar. It's kind of like a level below the aristocracy. So they are the elites, but they don't have that like nobility of from the king. You know, it's not the same bloodline, but they're
so
still
like in a romantasy, that's the prince's friend. That's probably a gentry or a member of the gentry.
That is an incredible way to put it. Yes. However, the colonies wanted to emulate what that was because in some ways the colonies were more monarchical than Britain itself at this time because they were emulating. They wanted to be rich and fancy and have all of the luxuries, especially the elite upper class. But at this time, the wealth distribution, like the wealth disparity, was actually far less than it is now. But this was seen as a natural order that you were born into whatever class you were in, and that inequality was weirdly seen as a necessity for a healthy society. So this was something I think in today's world, in today's mind, we could see these parallels, but to consider that as something that was just accepted and the natural order, I think that's really hard to wrap your mind around.
Well, yeah. I mean, imagine an entire community agreeing that you can only choose from these 4 jobs, but we want you to choose from these 4 jobs, and you want to choose from these 4 jobs. It does kind of suck that whatever you did, God decided that you only get to shovel manure, but we need someone to shovel manure.
Yeah.
And it's so good that some of you were born to this station. But on the flip side, you don't have to worry about learning to sew your own clothes because other parts of the community can take care of that for you. Sewing your clothes is a bad example, but you know what I mean.
Yes. Yes. And so even if you couldn't move up the social ladder, you could stay on your rank and gain respect, which is
do well. Right.
Yeah. And that's why you see a lot of these people who held 17 titles, who were elected to all these different positions because their name was so important when it came to the respect received.
So when we consider John Adams and his son, Abigail Adams' husband, John Adams really he would never have deigned to believe that his son could be the closest to royalty his country was willing to accept. Like, that would have been mind-blowing information for John Adams to believe that his son would end up a friggin' president.
Right. And in the circumstances that he did, because the American government at its founding was something that had never been seen before, but we're nowhere near that yet. Where we are is in 1735, where, John Adams' dad, John Adams, he and his wife, they had a baby named John Adams.
They named it John Adams. Yeah.
Yeah. So this is in 1735. John Adams, future president, future husband of Abigail Adams, was born. And what's interesting is John Adams, I'm just going to be talking about Abigail Adams' husband for now. Okay. He recalled later in life, he grew up with 2 parents who were both strong-willed. His mother, Susanna, was not a quiet and obedient woman. He often wrote about his parents.
Susanna. Susanna's my favorite character in this story so far.
Yeah, he often wrote about his parents arguing, and that sometimes his mother even won. And yeah. And so one of my favorite,
honestly, from 18th century, that is bold moves. both from Susanna and from John to be like, nah, mom kicked his butt verbally sometimes.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, this was a time where wives were seen as property. You know, you go from being the property of your father as a daughter to the property of your husband as a wife.
There were still bride prices and dowries being paid out at this time. It was a dying trend, but it would take another 100 years for bride prices and dowries to really taper the frick off.
Yeah. Yeah. And so John Adams said that he thought his upbringing was unusual because he thought that reason prevailed in the homes of most of his friends, but passion ruled within the Adams family. And this was incredibly unusual at the time because women were supposed to be obedient and subservient, and they were just property of their husbands, and that was incredibly unusual.
Honestly, it makes sense. It makes sense that John went from Susanna's son to Abigail's.
I literally thought the same thing. I thought the same exact thing because Abigail Adams was also a strong-willed woman.
Strong-willed. She wrote of their fights herself and then continued to tell John how he was wrong after he admitted he was wrong.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, Abigail ended up being one of John Adams' #1 consultants. Even when he was president, he would look to her for advice. Again, this was so unusual at the time, but we love Abigail. And honestly,
and we love Susanna. So tell me more about Susanna, because we're getting excited. Trying to jump ahead in the timeline.
I know. Well, so we're in Braintree, Massachusetts, right? And in this time period, in this type of farm town, children were also assets. So they would be put to work on the farm or in their homes by 8 to 10 years old, where they would carry on with what they were born to do, which is exactly what John's little brothers did. But John Adams' dad, John Adams, expected way more for his son, John Adams. And his mother...
John Adams was the oldest son, right?
Yes.
Okay. And we are still working in the confines of primogeniture. And that honestly still happens. But primogeniture, there were laws in England about primogeniture. Were there laws in the colonies about primogeniture?
You're going to have to define that word for me.
So primogeniture means that anything has to pass down to the firstborn son. Yes. And there were laws on the books that dictated that if you had land, title, certain types of property, certain types of commissions from the government or the king or the parliament, that passed down automatically upon your death to your firstborn son, firstborn living son. So you could have 4 daughters in a row, and it didn't matter. You had to have a son or your ish was forfeit.
Yes.
You could not pass it on. It would go to some distant cousin somewhere down the line that a great uncle spawned somewhere up the family tree. But in England, at various times in history, there were laws that said not only does it go to the firstborn son, it can't go to anybody but the oldest living male relative.
That is how it was. And around this time is when that started to shift. So there could be exceptions for widows. They could leave some assets to different family members as well. But generally it was the male heirs. Yes.
Okay.
Yeah. So very similar and not surprising because the colonies were emulating the motherland.
Right. Well, and then it makes sense why John Adams' dad, John Adams, would have a very high expectation for his eldest son because the business was being handed down to him. The titles, the deacons, the tax, the tithe collector, all of those things, those would be primed to be inherited by his oldest son, John Adams.
Exactly. And Susanna, John Adams' mother, before he was even born, had decided that their first son would receive a formal education, just like John Adams' grandparents had done, except John Adams' dad, John Adams, was the second born son. So it was actually his brother who got the formal education in that situation.
So John Adams' dad, John Adams, smart man, doing the best he could, perfectly happy to be a middle class, basically shoemaker, leather shoemaker.
Yeah, he was a shoemaker during the winter and a farmer during the summer.
Yeah, honestly, that scans. That's kind of a clever way to do it.
Yeah. Yeah.
He smart guy, but his brother got all the schooling. And Susanna was like, "Oh no. We're rinsing and repeating that one. The little one's on their own. John?"
Yeah. Exactly. And that's what it is, because providing a child from the middle class an education gave them an opportunity to move up the ladder. And at this time, if we're looking at the class divides, okay, we have the lower class, or the meaner sorts. They were called the meaner sorts. They were defined by their dependency. They were unskilled laborers, and they didn't own property. So,
which meant they were dependent on their landlord to keep the structure standing. They were dependent on the community to keep the well from collapsing and shutting off the community's water supply.
And that's a thing that is totally hard to wrap your mind around, is in this time, the wealthy, because there were such personal relationships. You have to think about how small these towns were. It was a smaller population. Everyone knew each other. And so the elites, the moneyed few, they would kind of emphasize this dependency because, oh, well, you need food for your family. Well, I am going to loan you this. I will give you this. And now that person is expected to have all of this gratitude, and now they owe them. Now they are dependent on them. And it really reinforced this structure. And so our middling sort, they were defined by what they did. Men were considered to be born for their jobs. So the occupational titles were meant for commoners. They had learned professions. So you're talking about your doctors, your blacksmith, your lawyer, anything like that, where they are landowners or farmer or merchant. These are the middling sort. They are defined by what they did.
I want to point out, this was not new. This had been the history of mankind up until this point. The reason we're describing it is because it's about to change. But consider how many people's names are Smith. They got that because somewhere back in their history, one of their ancestors was a Smith. And before surnames really took hold in most European cultures, you would have a given name, and then your surname would be identified with what you or your family did. So Smith, Taylor, Cobbler, Reed, so many patronymic names, last names, come from professions. Mason. We have been doing this. We have been assigning that if you are skilled enough to be a stonemason, you could be a respected member of the community, but you're a mason. Like, there's a level to how much you could do with the carving of the rock.
Right.
So it's been like this all the way for ages and ages and ages, centuries of people really assigning class divisions on purpose and finding value and definition in those class definitions. Like, it was a personality trait. And then we get to here in this specific part of history
where things start to change.
And a war happens.
Exactly.
A revolution that didn't just have to do with politics starts.
And then we have our gentlemen, the nobility, the aristocracy, the moneyed few. And they had so much money, in fact, that they could be disinterested enough to do public service, to be politicians, to serve in political roles, because that was a standard at the time, is that people who are doing these public services, they should be the moneyed few who they're not bringing a private interest in. They're not trying to make money from government. In fact, at the time, the amount of money that governments were spending on like public works infrastructure, it was so low because it was expected that these moneyed few who had so much money that they could have leisure time, they should be taking care of this. It was seen to have been an obligation and a burden. It should be a burdensome task, but you need to do it because of your place on the ladder. You have all this money, you get to have leisure, and you have to take care of everybody because you are now the patriarch. Everyone is going to go to you. They're dependent on you. You are at the top, so you have this obligation.
Would you like to know my favorite 18th century insult?
Absolutely, I would.
You smell like flowers. If someone from the working or middling class were to say, you smell like flowers, they were basically saying, you are so lazy and entitled. You've just been sitting in your house surrounded by florals and flowers. Get off your lazy bum and do something. Because it's one of my favorite call outs every time we see all of these like historical pieces and the rich people are walking through halls overflowing with flowers. And they did. Halls overflowing with flowers, fresh bouquets everywhere.
Man, someone get me some pearls to clutch, because what an insult.
You smell like flowers.
Darn. And at this time in the colonies, the moneyed few, a lot of them were frauds because they didn't have as much money as was required if you're talking about like the aristocracy, the nobility in Britain or in France, right? But that class divide still happened. And so what they started doing was like landlord, because then they're not working, right? Because this was the elites, the moneyed few were not supposed to work. That was their lot in life. They were not supposed to work. And so if you are working, now you have private interest. You cannot be in government, and you shouldn't want to be in government. This is a burden.
Right.
It's very, very interesting to consider. And at this time, ordinary people were seen to be physically different. They're too self-interested and ignorant to make good choices for the greater good. And the aristocrats' lavish lifestyles, the luxury they lived in, that was seen as a favor to the poor. It gave them purpose because it was widely believed that no one would work if they didn't have to, and society would crumble. And it's like an interesting think piece, because perhaps the ordinary people were different and too self-interested because they had to wonder if they could feed their families or if they could keep a roof over their head. Maybe that's why they were different. I don't know.
Right.
And maybe.
For as much as I can say, oh, well, it gave them good attitudes about wanting to be the best scullery maid they can. Yeah, but ultimately, they were also constantly living in fear that all of those rich people would take all of their... If a rich person moved away, if they moved out of their mansion, you know what work the scullery maids had to do?
Yeah.
And like living in that constant stress and fear that this rich person could just change their mind and upend your entire life. Because again, you still firmly believe, well, I can't be better than a scullery maid. And if there's no sculleries to maid, what am I supposed to do with myself?
Yeah. And when we're talking at this time, right,
I don't actually think
elites,
sculleries are things that one maids. I don't. Those aren't words.
At this time, you have these elites who are looking at the commoners as ignorant. They're not educated. Well, that's because at this time, the commoners, if they were lucky, could afford to send one child for higher learning. And this is in Massachusetts, where they had public school laws.
They did have public school in Massachusetts at the time.
From the 1600s, right? That's when the first laws were made. And they had public schools based on the population of the town. But for that higher level of learning, that cost money. And sometimes a family like the John Adams family, they could send one. And they were very lucky. Just the one.
Well, I mean, his buddy and Braintree resident John Hancock wouldn't have gotten a higher education had Uncle Thomas not swooped in and given John Hancock that extra education.
Yes, exactly. They started school together.
Yeah.
And So John Adams, he was born into those middling circumstances, and he started going to school, same school as John Hancock, and then he went on to Latin school, which was kind of like not secondary education, but it's above that primary education.
Mhm.
Like the Latin schools, that was for the elites or for the people who had the money to send their kids there. And usually you would be in the Latin school for 6 to 8 years. And the goal was to go to university after that. And in this area, that typically meant Harvard, where.
So basically, that was like the arts and sciences high schools of today.
Yeah, kind of.
Yeah.
And most Harvard students were expected to become lawyers or clergymen. And the thing with clergymen is they were immediately seen as gentlemen. It didn't matter what their money was. It didn't matter anything else, right? Because now they are serving God. They were given this purpose. They are now gentlemen. And
okay.
Yeah. So fun thing about John Adams, he was not a motivated student. He was defiant. He didn't love school, and he would frequently sneak away to fish or hunt. And when he was stuck in class and couldn't sneak away, he daydreamed, and he was bored.
It just sounds like how I handled school, and I was an A+, gifted and talented.
Yeah.
But I still didn't like it. I didn't want to do it. I just couldn't think of anything better to do.
Right. And that's at Latin school. They would sit there and like recite Latin texts over and over and over, right? Like it sounded boring.
For 6 to 8 years?
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, they did a couple other things, but like it was called Latin school, right?
I know, but
he was not a good student. Like he was really defiant. He was always sneaking out. He and his dad argued a lot about this. And eventually, John Adams tells John Adams' dad, John Adams, that he did not want to complete his education or go to college. He just wanted to be a farmer. And this is one of my favorite childhood John Adams stories. And we don't know the full truth of it. John Adams did say this happened, but John Adams said a lot of things, and we'll get to that at a later date. So he says that he told
John
his dad
Adams doesn't have a real job anyway.
You know, it's funny about that because John Adams was the first person to kind of make the joke that the vice president has the least important job in all of politics. Like he was the person to originate that, and it came from a petty place. But we're not there yet.
I am quite sure that the vice president has a job, and I know they've got an important job in the Senate. I get that part of the job, but that's a more rare job.
Okay, you've unlocked it. So when John Adams was vice president, he went into Congress and he had an opinion that he shared, and very shortly after, they held a vote. They wrote a bill and held a vote that silenced him. They were like, we don't like it when you talk here. So they literally were legislating that. Shut up. Yeah,
no,
they
John.
really said talk less, smile more.
Go talk to Abby, baby. No, she cares. We don't.
Yeah. Yeah.
I found my new favorite love-hate relationship with the founding father. It is now my favorite thing ever, and I will seize every opportunity to tease Abigail's husband.
And the funny thing is I actually don't think John Adams gets enough credit. He's kind of looked at in this very obscure way, and we even do it here. But the thing with John Adams is he gives us more insight onto the inner workings of things than nearly any other founding father, because he wrote everything down and he was honest about his feelings in his diary. Like we could look at the things that George Washington wrote and Jefferson and everyone else, but they were very kind of guarded. They expected that their diaries would be read in posterity. And John Adams was like, I'm going to write everything down. And
that's what I was going to say. I will tease John Adams like at every turn. Yeah. I'm not changing my stance here.
We'll tease all of them.
I haven't read as much as you have, but I have been required to read several letters. George Washington, heartstring pulling writing. Thomas Jefferson, if he were a novelist in the current times, I'm pretty sure he would be writing the think pieces, the ones that you read and you have to read 19 times to get.
Yeah, he was doing that then.
I know.
Yeah.
But John Adams, John Adams was just writing. He was writing Facebook posts of the time.
Yeah, he was so sensitive. Yeah,
but he was. It was really good writing. Like it was.
It gave
a sense of. I read a letter that he wrote to Abigail, and it was shortly after the war, or it might have been after the occupation of Boston. No, it was during the occupation of Boston. But he wrote a letter, and it's difficult even for writing to make me cry. And I was getting a little misty just because the sense of hope coupled with hopelessness that his rather approachable words, Thomas Jefferson used the ridiculous language.
Yeah.
John Adams didn't do that so much. Anyway, we haven't even gotten to John and Abigail meeting, and we're talking about letters during the occupation.
Okay. All right. We were at, he didn't want to go to school. He wanted to be a farmer. And his dad was like, farmer? I'll show you what a farmer is. And the next day, early in the morning, they went out into a marsh and they worked all day. And they were knee deep in mud doing hard labor from sun up until sundown. Afterwards, they walked back to the house, and John Adams' dad, John Adams, asked him, well, how do you like that? To which John Adams replied, I like it very well, sir. To which his dad replied, well, I don't like it so well. You're going to school and you're complying with my desires. So he was like, I'm going to show you hard labor. Oh, here we go. Hard labor all day. How do you like that? I like it. Too bad. All right. Yeah.
That backfired magnificently. Okay.
Yeah. And so his dad's like, well, you're going to school. Like, you're doing what I said. And, but the thing he did do, he did find him a new teacher. And so then in less than 2 years, he was on his way to Harvard. And Harvard had a ranking system for their students based on social class, not ability. So you could be re-ranked based on your behavior, but the hierarchy at Harvard very much mirrored the world it existed in. So students were ranked based on the wealth of their family and their own class and the privileges that they would receive, the type of boarding they would receive, the food that they would receive was based on their ranking. And the students were taught about rank and precedence at the college and how to behave depending on their status. The lower status the student and the higher status person they encountered determined at what distance they would need to remove their hat before approaching. So if they were coming up to a teacher or a tutor or an upperclassman or the same level classman with a higher rank, they would have to learn at what point to take their hat off when approaching them. And most understood how they were supposed to behave and where their standing was. But if they didn't, there was always lashings. They would be
I was going to say, there's no possible way. We were well past the witch burning periods by this point. They still would have burned my butt as a witch. I swear to God.
Yeah, same. But they also had, this was an interesting thing I learned, they had guidebooks to teach people how to interact with other classes, right?
Well, yeah, obviously I need to know what 6 feet looks like. I'm not even sure I could tell you what 2 of them are.
Yeah, but these guidebooks, it was even more than just the hat taking off, right? And like George Washington copied by hand to teach himself how to behave and be well-mannered. In the book that he copied down, like there was like 100 different things that he hand wrote out to teach himself. It was called The Rules of Civility and Decent Behavior in Company and Conversation. And this was...
You are never allowed to tease me about book titles ever again.
No, I'm still gonna. And... But what was also interesting is there was guidebooks for those in a higher social standing on how to treat those below them. And in this type of society, many people had to know both how to treat those above them and below them. They were reading books about how to treat people that were below them and above them. And then they just accepted it. This is how things are. This is where we are. This is where I stand. And that's how it is.
Listen, looking back with modern sensibilities, modern understanding, and modern privilege. It feels uncomfortable to think about it like that.
Yep.
I'm just putting that out there. I don't have anything to make it feel better. It just feels uncomfortable to think about it like that.
Yeah. And John Adams, he was 15 years old when he went to Harvard. But fortunately, during his time in college, he did find a love of learning. And
I thought you were going to say of his life. I was like, oh, he met Abigail? No.
Not yet. We will get there today.
I'll run my mouth about that man. He loved his wife.
Yeah, he did, but he wasn't good at showing it. I think a lot of the notes I took while reading the book about John Adams were like, deadbeat dad. Why is he ignoring his wife? I'm going to have to share pictures of the way I take notes sometime because they make me laugh. So, but at this time, a lot of Harvard grads, like when John Adams was born, a good portion of Harvard graduates went into the clergy or became lawyers. But by the time that he graduated, there were more going into medicine. There were more going into business, and some would become teachers, and like less common, they would get a Harvard education and then just become a farmer. But I mean, then you have Samuel Adams who went to Harvard and then did nothing. So, I mean, he started a revolution, but that was much later.
He just ran his mouth. That's all.
Yeah. So John Adams' dad, John Adams, wanted him to join the clergy, but that sounded boring to Abigail Adams' future husband. However, lawyers were seen as self-serving, and they were thought to do anything to advance their own self-interest, and they acted on their private interests. And this is what John Adams' dad, John Adams, believed, but Abigail Adams' future husband thought it was old school thinking, and he wanted to go to Boston. But he also wanted to be a great man with honor and reputation, and so he would frequently write out these conflicting thoughts in his diary. And
spoilers, sweetie.
Yeah. And so he wrote in his diary that he longed for the day when his achievements would be esteemed as great. And he wanted notoriety from at least his early 20s. He also had wrote in his diary, I am not ashamed to own that a prospect of an immortality in the memories of all the worthy to the end of time would be a high gratification to my wishes. So he is saying, I want to be known. I want to be famous, right? But at the same time that he is writing about how he wants notoriety, that he wants to be famous, that he wants his achievements to be well known, he is also criticizing his own decisions, that he shouldn't be so self-serving and vain, that vanity was his biggest vice and biggest folly. So he's really going through this like turmoil internally. I want to do these things. This is what I am being called to do, but I shouldn't want this. I am wrong for it.
You know, we love a self-aware person because honestly, most of self-awareness is sort of balancing what it is we think we want and whether that is a valid thing to want to pursue.
Yeah.
Even if it's okay to want, is it going to trample over other people and require I step on the necks of others to get what I want? In which case, no, it is not a valid pursuit.
Yeah. And he was frequently questioning his reasons why. Were they good reasons or were they self-serving? And so he's very conflicted.
Well, John, I've got good news for you. You are, in fact, remembered. You got a legacy. We call you Abigail's husband, but you're still there. You're in the narrative, buddy.
You're still there. So once he graduates, he took a job as a teacher in Worcester, Mass, and he didn't like it. He wrote to his diary again.
Surprising.
Yeah.
She's a diva.
Yeah. And so he was still writing to his diary, trying to decide whether to go into law or not, which I guess was like a good practice, arguing with himself, because he did go on to study law a few years later, around 1758.
I feel like he didn't have any friends. That's why he just journaled to himself.
Sometimes he would journal about how he didn't have any friends.
John!
But this changed. This changed when he went to Boston. So he gets to Boston and he calls some of Boston's most notable lawyers up, but not on the phone because they didn't have those. And he obtained some mentors, one of whom being a Mr. James Otis Jr.
Oh, we love James, Lightning Boy.
Yeah. But to his diary, he complained of the bootstraps he had to pull himself up by as a commoner trying to move up the social ladder, saying that he had no books for his library and no friends to pave his way. He said, "It is my destiny to dig treasures with my own fingers. Nobody will lend me or sell me a pickaxe." And I feel like that is such like a poignant thing
about that. He's got a point.
He's got a point. I feel like that is something that kind of a lot of folks could find relatable. It is my destiny to dig treasures with my own fingers. Nobody will lend me or sell me a pickaxe.
But the difference here is he's not saying no one will give me treasure. Yeah. No one is giving me tools to find the treasure easier. We're all digging for the same treasure, but some of you have pickaxes and privilege. I've got my own fingers, but we're all still digging.
And that's exactly it, because he is looking at his peers, the other new lawyers of Boston who come from the upper class, who have money, who have these connections. And here he is. And thankfully, he did some good interviews. He gained some good mentors, right? And so he decided to give himself a better edge, that he was going to dedicate himself to a several years long strict regimen of study to give him this edge. And then he didn't do that and started socializing instead.
That felt...
Yeah, he's just, it's very relatable in a lot of ways. Like, how many times do we go, I'm going to change my life, I'm going to do something different, and then you're like, I didn't do that though, right? But now for the
I made a nighttime routine that it made 2 weeks. 2 weeks.
That's impressive.
Before I was like, I don't want to do it anymore.
But now that he's in Boston, he finally has time for leisure, and he has peers in the city of Boston while still pouring through all his conflicting thoughts into his diary and scolding himself for not reading the books that he promised himself he would. And then in 1759, he met a certain Abigail Smith. But John Adams was painfully awkward around women throughout his entire life. Through his whole life.
Mood, bro.
And at the time that he met Abigail Smith, he was also heartbroken from his first love marrying someone else because he was taking too long to propose. So he wasn't into Abigail yet. But then we move on. We're in 1761. He watched James Otis Jr. give that fiery speech in front of Thomas Hutchinson and Francis Bernard against the writs of assistance. He took notes. And that was about the time that he realized he couldn't force himself to be just like the people he admired, but he could figure himself out more. Also that year, John Adams' dad, John Adams, passed away. But also that year...
Sorry, other John.
Yeah. But also that year, he was reintroduced to Abigail Smith in 1761. And by 1763, the pair were inseparable. And he is still really slow to get to things, though. And eventually, with Abigail's persuasion, he did propose. And they did.
Abigail's persuasion.
Yeah. Because she knew.
Bro, you lost one. You
want
to go 2 for 2?
And so
if you like it, then you put a ring on it.
But so they were reintroduced. They get together around 1761. They didn't marry until October 1764. Now, their marriage was...
we were sugar acting and ritzing and...
Yeah. And think about how long of a engagement that was at that time. They would get married quick, right? We're talking months. This was a years-long relationship before they got married. Now, they did push the wedding back a little bit to October because they decided that John should get inoculated for smallpox first. So he did. Abigail also kind of pushed him on that one. And so they got married in October 1764, which is right where we left off last episode with Samuel Adams, talking to all those clubs. Full circle. Maybe next episode we'll get the square. the riots are coming, okay? Because everything I have talked about is directly related. The mobs, the riots, the chaos, and effigies were seen as
You
normal.
have to know the class, you have to know
Yes.
the players, you have to know the words and why everyone was mad for different but
Yeah.
also the same reasons.
Yes. And that is exactly the thing, is that the mobs and the riots and the chaos and the effigies, they were seen as normal behavior from ordinary people. It was like the moneyed few, they kind of saw it as a parent responding to a toddler tantrum. Like, let him cry it out. His brain's not fully developed yet. It didn't threaten their authority.
I am uncomfy again, Tori.
That's so it didn't threaten their authority until one riot where a certain moneyed person named Thomas Hutchinson was a target. That was new. But I did tell you.
He earned all that, though.
It's complicated.
He did some shady. There was some shady. And since I know he didn't die in that, there was some shady.
It's complicated. But we're getting there.
All right.
I did tell you I would explain why only landowning white men could vote. And that was because of the same reason that the moneyed few were allowed to hold office. Because if you were dependent on someone else for the roof over your head, for the food that you eat, then you will be voting with personal private interest. And they thought that the politics, that the elections, that the representatives, they should be free of private interest because they are serving for the greater good.
All right.
Yeah. So, thank you for listening to Founded. I hope you found something interesting. Drop an email at foundedhistory@gmail.com and let me know what you want to find out next. Now that we've talked about Abigail Adams' husband, maybe we'll eventually get to some riots.
I dare say they've started a riot.
There's going to be lots of riots. But don't
I'm
forget
so excited.
Don't forget to like, subscribe, and leave a rating. We'll see you next time. Well, you'll see us.